My basic two reforms are subordination under the Constitution of corporate rights to human rights. And the second is to, and this is the most important, is to strengthen local business.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capitalism, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
As our loyal listeners know, at Capitalism, we distinguish between positions that are pro-capitalists, which we call pro-business, and positions that are pro-capitalism, which we label pro-market. Sometimes the two positions are sufficiently aligned such that it's difficult to distinguish them. Other times they are so far apart that it's impossible to miss the difference. If there is one person who, at least in the popular conception, cannot be accused of being pro-business, that's Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate who has transformed America. Just recently, he published a book entitled The Rebellious CEO, where he celebrates some of the benefits of the free enterprise system.
While he never held public office, Nader was repeatedly considered one of the most influential people in America during the last 60 years. Yes, you heard well, 60, because Nader just turned 90 at the end of February.
It was back in 1965 that Ralph Nader became famous with his first book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was a fierce critique of the safety record of the American car industry, and particularly of General Motors. That helped lead to the passage of the National Traffic and Motor Safety Vehicle Act of 1966.
He pissed off GM so much with that initiative that actually GM went after him. They followed him, tried to entrap him, wiretap him, and he won a legal case against GM. And with that money, he hired a group of young students that became famous as the Nader's Raiders to study all the failure in Washington, from the FTC to the failure of Congress. He wrote a book, Who Run Congress, who sold more than 1 million copies. To sell 1 million copies of a book talking about Congress, you really need to be good.
I think it's almost unfortunate, given Nader's track record on really substantive policy issues, that he made 4 bids to become the president of the United States, and that people almost know him more for that. He ran with the Green Party in 1996 and 2000, the Reform Party in 2004, and as an independent in 2008. It's funny, I took an Uber driver here to my parents' place in Mississippi, and he asked what I did, and said, this podcast, and I said, we're going to have Ralph Nader on. And he said, oh, I can't stand that guy because he's the reason that we have George Bush as president. And so Nader got blamed for taking votes away from Gore and Gore v. Bush and leading to Bush's presidency. It's a shame, given his track record on so many issues that this Uber driver would have agreed with wholeheartedly, that's what jumps out at people.
Can I say something politically incorrect? That Nader was the Russian interference of 2000? That whenever the Democrats lose, they need to blame somebody. And in 2016, they blamed the Russian interference. And in 2000, they blamed Nader.
But, it is interesting in thinking about him. And I've wondered about this, particularly with his recent book and listening to some of the podcasts that he's been on and some of what he's written, that I wonder about how much Nader has been misrepresented and why he's been misrepresented. And if there's something to that, going back to your comments about GM's attack on him, which might be that his positions are actually more reasonable than people might think. I would have dismissed him. I would have thought he was completely just an unreasonable fringe person who wanted to destroy the American system and destroy capitalism. And that's actually not who he is at all. And I wonder if I think that because so many corporate interests were afraid of him and had to make him out to be more extreme than he is in order to avoid grappling with his very rational views. What was your view of him before we engaged with his work coming into our podcast?
You even asked this question? Of course I go for the conspiracy theory that he's completely sort of misrepresented because of the power of corporate interest. This is why I think that it would be very interesting to have him on the show and ask him some of the questions and see how he answers them. In 1971, when Lewis Powell wrote his famous memorandum entitled An Attack on the American Free Enterprise System, he cited you as one of the leaders of that attack. But last year, you wrote a book celebrating capitalists dedicated to social causes. Did Powell get you wrong, or did you change your mind?
The corporate interests always confuse criticisms of corporate crime, corporate misbehavior, corporate coercion with attacking market enterprise. Every culture in the world has markets. They organize them differently, but I've always maintained that distinction, highlighting a sort of version of Gresham's law that unregulated and undeterred bad business drives out good business because it creates unfair competitive advantages like monopolistic practices, corporate crime, deceptive advertising, unfair corporate subsidies and guarantees by the government. That tilts the balance with companies that want to do it honestly, and which CEOs I have portrayed, a dozen of them in my new book, The Rebellious CEO, 12 rebellious CEOs who got it right.
One of the things we talk about a lot about on this podcast sounds a lot like what you just said. We talk about being pro-markets, but not necessarily pro-business. And it sounds like you might agree that a version of capitalism that is pro-markets actually works and makes sense. Is that fair?
To a limited extent. The markets reflect sensory perceptions by people. They are sub-markets that are more vulnerable. Children's are more vulnerable to corporate manipulation, especially in the internet age. Elderly are often more vulnerable to market exploitation, such as door-to-door sales. So there are sub-markets. And then there are values of a society that cannot be anticipated by the sensory perceptions of market engagers, like consumers. For example, radiation exposure. You can't feel it, touch it, or see it, but it's real. Latent chemical toxics, the same thing. Far-seen perils coming on, but not materializing, cannot be really corralled by market mechanisms. And that's why in our country we have developed very modestly a mixed public-private system where some of the necessities of the people, like automobile safety and safety devices, ignored by the style and horsepower obsessions of the auto companies, had to be installed and defended by public mandates or government regulation.
So let me try a slightly different version of the same question, because I get from your answer that maybe you think that you seem to have been portrayed as too radical vis-a-vis what you really are, that at the heart you are pro-capitalist system, but a fair system where people are protected in various ways, and not an unfair system where the large corporations have a disproportionate say. Is that a correct assessment?
It's partially correct. I make a distinction between big corporate capitalism and capitalism small business on Main Street, USA, for example. They are not only different in degree, they're different in kind, Luigi. They just have a completely different impact on government. Small business is free to go bankrupt when they don't meet market signals. Big business often goes to Washington instead for a bailout. They have now become too big to jail. The level of corporate crime prosecution in the Justice Department has been on a declining curve for years. And that's because corporate lawyers have created abilities to daunt any government prosecutor, drag things on, go over their heads to the political appointees, and so forth. Corporate capitalists are really often not even capitalists. For example, corporate capitalists control their owners. Capitalism principle number one is if you own property or if you own a business, you're supposed to have reasonable control. Well, our shareholders have very little control. They're basically told, if you don't like what your hired bosses are doing in an executive suite and on the board of directors, you can quit and sell your stock. Another principle of capitalism is you're free to fail. Well, these corporations are increasingly concentrated in a few industries. They're considered critical to the national security. They go to Washington for a bewildering variety of subsidies, handouts, giveaways, quotas, bailouts. Half of what Washington is doing really is shoehorning corporate predictability and control against risk. And another example of why corporations defy elementary principles of capitalism, you're not supposed to control markets. You're supposed to obey markets. And there are all kinds of ways where corporations craving predictability and engaging in strategic planning eliminate commercial-free zones all over our culture that were once banned. You did not directly market to children years ago, bypassing parents. Gambling was considered a commercial-free zone. Unfortunately, it went underworld, except for Las Vegas. Education, public education, was not supposed to be prey for commercialization. It certainly is, right up to the university. And if you look around our country, Luigi, there's almost no area of our political economy and culture and society that is not being strategically planned by corporations. They want to be free to throw off their risks into the environment in the form of pollution. They want to strategically plan our energy future, our land use future, and on and on. And this is quite extraordinary, and I don't think academics, with a few exceptions, are keeping up with the proliferation and insinuation of corporate power in our very society. You'll all remember that in the early 19th century, when the modern corporation emerged, say in Massachusetts with the textile factories, they were put on a short leash. First of all, they got their charter to exist from the legislature, not from some government commission. And some of them were put on a 10-year renewal for good behavior. Well, that's long gone now, and the corporate charter is hardly ever mentioned. In fact, if you ask most business students who starts corporations, they'll say investors. No, as you all know, it's the state, mostly Delaware and Reno, Nevada. They're the ones who give out the charter that creates the pact between the government and investors to exist. And as a result, that charter can be conditioned. And as one of your colleagues has written in a great book, Hal Weitzman, he wrote this book, What's the Matter with Delaware? The compact between the state of Delaware, state of Nevada, and others is completely obsolete. I used to joke during my campaigns that General Motors and DuPont, by the way, are chartered in Delaware. And I used to joke and say, you know, GM could buy Delaware in a weekend if DuPont was willing to sell it. To this day, with some exceptions of good Delaware court decisions recently, to this day, Delaware relies on revenues for its state budget for a whole variety of surcharges and license fees by having 1.5 million corporations chartered in the state of Delaware. Many of them shell corporations, of course, but many of them the leading corporations in our country. Citigroup and J.P. Morgan, I think, is there, and of course General Motors is there because of its permissive jurisdiction. So I would like business schools to start having discussions and seminars on elevating the federal corporate chartering level to at least try to aspire to hold global corporations running from jurisdiction to another more accountable. So we need to make these very fine distinctions between big corporate capitalism that can flee the jurisdiction, go to tax havens, go abroad, download their profits, escape taxation. Small business capitalists can't do that. And I think that distinction needs to be made in terms of clarifying the principles of capitalism that are institutionally violated by giant multinational corporations.
You've talked about the importance of staying optimistic, and yet this, as a history of American business, is a pretty pessimistic view. How do you maintain optimism in the face of that, and why has this happened? Is it fixable at this stage, or is this the inevitable decline into what some people call late-stage capitalism?
Well, the problem is that the risks of a modern technological society with weapons of mass destruction, ongoing pandemics, artificial intelligence without legal and ethical frameworks reaching generative stages, nuclear biological and chemical weapons, elected dictatorships around the world. Once that's the operating ground for corporations, they can become very harmful. When electricity started and you had a corporation producing electricity, it wasn't involved with nuclear power plants whose meltdown can contaminate radioactively huge areas of land and people. And the same is true with the food processing area, which has become very highly chemicalized, pesticides, herbicides, all kinds of other chemicals. So you have the same level of avarice as prior generations, but the tools that they are working with now are far more penetrating and powerful, which means that the countervailing forces that we used to rely on have to keep up to par. Let's look at some of them. The labor unions have gotten much weaker. Consumer groups are pathetically weaker. Countervailing power of government regulators, the brilliant intellectual advocacy of corporate lawyers is gaming that system, learning how to delay a proposed regulation for years, learning how to dilute it, oppose its enforcement, learning how to elect people who put the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on hold under Trump. The media is increasingly commercialized, and while they do good investigations, they just can't keep up. So my proposal is, number one, we cannot have equal justice under the law if corporations, artificial persons, have equal rights with human beings. It's impossible, especially when with these equal rights, they create unequal rights like bankruptcy rights. They create huge disparities in wealth and political influence. As a result, what you've seen is an out-of-control system that depreciates our own yardsticks and ethical standards. I mean, we have no ethical standards for so many of these new technologies, nanotech, biotech, and no legal frameworks, as I mentioned, artificial intelligence. At the same time, the corporations have moved from limited liability for their investors to limited liability for the corporation itself, a transmutation that has escaped a great deal of notice. So we need to strengthen union countervailing power, repeal the Taft-Hartley law and other anti-union organizing strictures, worse in the Western world, I might add. We need to develop a reciprocity to strengthen consumer groups. I mean, why do corporations get subsidies that consumers don't get? Support in any way reciprocal to what Washington and state capitals give corporations. We need to strengthen the power of the universities to be free of commercial influence so they can become our intellectual seedbed and they can speak out more forcefully. Strengthen local business. With new technologies now, you can have local energy production, renewable, solar panels, etc. You can have banking in the form of cooperative banks and credit unions expanding. You can have health clinics replacing a lot of the unnecessary diagnosis and drug promotion, emphasizing prevention. You can have local sports that are not spectator sports, they're participatory sports for all ages, good for physical exercise and the health. You can have local transport. In other words, with local economies that are almost by definition more accountable, you can strengthen family businesses and make sure that you're not going to be controlled by businesses that can close down and go to China, India, Malaysia, or Mexico at a moment's notice, hollowing out communities and leaving workers bereft. So it's subordination under the Constitution and strengthening local economies.
Many of the entrepreneurs, if not most of them you celebrate in your book, run privately held companies. Do you think that if being publicly traded isn't totally incompatible with the kind of capitalism that you aspire to, do you think it makes it more difficult?
Well, it does for the reasons I've just given. But these 12 CEOs, and by the way, I really would hope that this book would be used in business courses around the country because, first of all, it's good news. Second of all, there needs to be yardsticks. I mean, these youngsters coming out of school, undergraduate and business school, The only yardsticks they're given thinking about giant corporations is what I call market fundamentalism. Namely, the corporate executives saying, "Don't blame us. We're just meeting market demand. We're just responding to the market." Well, we know all kinds of ways that markets can be controlled and manipulated and co-opted and destroyed. So these 12 CEOs, they had wildly different personalities, but they had very consistent principles and character. For example, they admitted their mistakes publicly. Today, you look at Boeing. I mean, look at the opiate manufacturers. Look at the tobacco companies. They would criticize their own industry, unabashedly. They wouldn't be secretive. Saul Price, who started the Price Club, which led to Costco, he actually shared his secrets with the approaching big box competition, like Sam's Club. They engaged in civic pursuits and persuasions. They saw themselves as citizens, not just businesses. They almost never whined in my interaction with them for regulation. When Anita Roddick came from England with her franchise body shops, she had to go to the FDA, and she was so astonished. She started badgering them how weak they were. They couldn't figure her out. She would say, "Well, what's going on here? You hardly regulate any of these cosmetics," and a lot of them are becoming like drugs in terms of their advertising and so on. They didn't overpay themselves. Herb Kelleher, who started Southwest Airlines, paid himself the least amount, $750,000 a year. He had stock options of any of his major competitors at United and American. John Bogle, who created Vanguard, which now has $7.5 trillion in assets managing, the concentration of power by State Street, Vanguard, and Fidelity, and a couple others of the securities markets. He said, as one of his last speeches, he said, "This is very dangerous," and he included Vanguard. Paul Hawken, needless to say, stimulated so many corporations to consider the environment, recycling, climate change with all kinds of speeches. Bob Townsend took the issue of corporate bureaucracy on. Until he came along, bureaucracy meant government. And he excoriated multi-tiers of corporate bureaucracy, stifling initiative, getting systems of sycophancy to executive suite. But the one big common thing they did was they paid attention to profits. And they said, without profits, we can't do these things. However, they reversed the model. Instead of saying, here's the model of profitable business, and I'm going to adjust workers and consumers and other externalities to meet that high aspiration of maximum profit. What they did is they started with the workers and the consumers and the environment as preconditions for making a profit. So one day I called up Herb Kelleher. He always took the call. That's another thing. They return calls, most of them. Try that today. I called up Herb and I said, as an airline passenger on Southwest, and I always choose Southwest, I want to thank you for the way you prioritize consumers. And he said, I don't prioritize consumers. I said, what do you mean? He said, I have prioritize my people. That's what we called as workers. And if I treat my workers well, they're going to treat consumers well. And that's going to make our shareholders happy. So they reversed.
Speaking of Vanguard, you, Ralph, has been a model of civic engagement in many, many forms. But there is one that, if I'm not mistaken, you personally never engage in, which is at the shareholder level. I know that there was in 1970 a campaign GM by your followers, but if I'm not mistaken, you are not involved in that. And so you mentioned Vanguard. As you said, Vanguard has a disproportionate amount of power today. And the power at the end of the day is our power, because most Americans, through their 401ks, have shares in Vanguard and similar companies. In principle, they own this company, or they should have some say in this company. But in practice, they are so dispersed and so busy doing something else, they don't exercise their right of ownership, and they delegate to people that don't follow what they want. My idea, that is inspired by something that's been going on in political science, is to try to pick a random representative of the investor in Vanguard and having them direct the way Vanguard votes its shares in the various shareholders meeting, and do the same for BlackRock and do the same for State Street. This is a way to bring democracy to the corporate world. What do you think about this idea?
Well, I agree completely. We have now giant institutional shareholders who can really throw their weight around because they own large amounts of shares. We've tried that. We've actually written to the heads of BlackRock and Vanguard to try to get them to exert their influence to turn Boeing back into an engineering company after the crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia and the financialization of that company pursuant to the unfortunate merger with McDonnell Douglas. We tried to get them to exercise on other issues involving companies. For example, Apple has a supplier in China, as you know, where the workers are horribly exploited, and they have nets to keep workers who commit suicide by jumping out of the 5th or 12th floor of the factory to catch them. Shareholders can have great leverage with Apple, but no, they don't even deal with executive pay. Warren Buffett happens to think that executive pay out of control is a huge corrupting force inside the corporation, not only setting a bad example, but manipulating accounting, unjustifiable stock buybacks to make the metrics look better and so forth for executive pay. So I'm at my wit's end. I can't answer your question with any functional response. I try to get people to start groups just focusing on that, on getting owners to start exerting more control over what they own, namely the pension funds and the mutual funds. And I don't get much interest on that at all. I was a little involved in Campaign GM, and I thought that was going to launch shareholder efforts. And it partly now is you have virtual shareholder meetings now. You can't even stand up and eyeball the CEO anymore. So I was left with one idea. It's called the Penny Brigade. There are trillions of outstanding shares of U.S. companies on the stock exchanges. Less than 20, 30 billion shares at a penny each would fund one full-time overseer for these institutional shareholders for every Fortune 500 company, so that they would have a whole crew of specialists, one over each company, feeding back to them and showing what they can achieve for the country beyond simply being passive shareholders. A lot of institutional shareholder executives have told me over the years, we're not staffed for this, Ralph. We're if we don't like the company, we express our displeasure by selling the shares or diminishing them. We're not staffed. Okay, well, this Penny Brigade could staff it, and it could be created overnight. Just think of the number of shares controlled by Fidelity and Vanguard alone. And all you need is I forgot what the actual figure was I calculated, something like 20 or 30 billion shares to fund 500 watchdogs.
So staffing could be one explanation for the lack of involvement of big institutional shareholders, but do you think there's anything else going on too? And is there any analogy between the disengagement of big institutional shareholders and the disengagement of the public in politics, local politics and national politics?
Well, Bethany, I'm sorry to say, I think the public, with very few exceptions, have surrendered. You can see that with the lack of pushback on fine print contracts. Freedom of contract was a conservative pillar early in our history, coming out of England. The famous statement by the scholar Henry Maine, when he said, "The transition from medieval to modern age can be marked by the transition from status as a serf to contract, artisan, negotiating for his or her work." And now we're back to status. The fine print contract has never been worse. We used to study it for one day in law school. Now they don't even spend 2 days, even though through it, trillions of dollars of transactions occur. And the imbalance between the vendor and the buyer is staggering. You now have compulsory arbitration provisions. You have rewriting the contract unilaterally into fine print. So if the airlines say we're going to give you now you're going to have 60,000 frequent flyer miles for trips, you say, I didn't agree to that. Oh, yes, you did. It was on the contract that is on file at the FAA, which you don't have a full copy of. So, this contract peonage, contract servitude, they're blocking wrongfully injured people from having their full day in court. That's called tort reform. We call it tort deform. They're now requiring workers to sign anti-disparagement, or if they leave, they have to pay. These are just ordinary manual workers for franchises. And so it's just getting worse and worse. I don't know what the turnaround is. What can lead these corporate executives to have a higher interest of their own, a higher sense of their own significance, and not simply look to an easy retirement after a few years at the helm? I don't know what can be done with that. The organized religious groups have given up. They don't provide us with ethical frameworks. You don't even hear them talking about gambling. Gambling is a serious sign of cultural decay. And now the companies are moving into addicting youngsters, giving them advance money to teach them how to gamble over their iPhone, internet gambling. While I sound pretty pessimistic, I know that there's overwhelming evidence among the common folk that they're being controlled. The Business Week poll of that 20 years ago went over 70% thought that big business had too much control of their life. So I guess what we have to do is pick up the knowledge from Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, our third president, who basically said, you got to have political democracy countervailing forces to what he called the moneyed interests. So our channel is Congress, state legislatures, city council. We outnumber the corporations, and there's no reason why we can't take democratic control over these institutions in order to be the proper countervailing power to giant corporations, for whom commercialism uber alles is their mandate.
Now, you speak against excessive amount of power given to corporation and even sort of rights given to corporation. But if I'm not mistaken, you were behind the famous Virginia State Pharmacy Board case that gave the freedom of speech right to corporations. Do you regret being involved, or what went wrong?
Boy, talk about a backfire, huh, Luigi? Here's what happened. The pharmaceutical industry, especially retail pharmacists, got laws at the state level banning comparative pricing for over-the-counter and other drugs. So the people walking in couldn't compare prices between stores. So our litigation group brought a case and won it, and inadvertently gave a massive tool to corporations, filing subsequent lawsuits claiming again and again that advertisement is free speech and is to be protected. And then they went into the political arena and basically said political speech is to be protected under the First Amendment, which got them the Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. You're right. It was the biggest boomerang of a lawsuit that we've ever brought. My only consolation is they would have probably brought subsequent ones anyway, but our case opened the door.
Now, one source of countervailing power is, of course, an antitrust authority. You have lived a long life, so you grew up in the 50s and 60s when antitrust in the United States was very enforced very strongly. Then you lived for a long period from the 70s to basically until a few years ago, where antitrust went out of fashion. And some people even accuse your consumerist movement to be responsible for the demise of antitrust. And now we see that with Jonathan Cantor and Lena Khan, there seems to be a resurgence of antitrust. Can you sort of tell us what is your position of antitrust, whether it's changed over time, and what you think of Jonathan Cantor and Lena Khan in those positions?
Well, I think very highly of them. And there is a renaissance of sorts that you allude to under the Biden administration, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. They're horribly underfunded. Their budgets are absurd. I mean, you take all the lawyers, Luigi, and they don't amount to half of one of the giant law firms that are operating in our country, just one. I'm very impressed by the current regime, but as you know, it can disappear next January. So the problem with antitrust enforcement is the antitrust lawyers for the companies can drag the cases on beyond the life of an administration and hope that another administration will drop the cases. But so far, so good.
So we've touched a couple of times on social media, and I'm hard-pressed to think of somebody you would disagree with more than Florida's Ron DeSantis, and yet he just proposed banning social media for kids under the age of 14. Do you agree with him on this?
Well, not only him, a lot of right-wingers. The head of the Heritage Foundation spoke out the other day in an op-ed in the Washington Post. Yes, I do. I don't think children should be allowed to have their iPhone and credit card and unimpeded access 24/7 to avaricious, cruel marketeers. These people have no boundaries. If 5 hours a day is what the child spends, they want 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, separating them from family, community, and nature, by the way, and seducing them into the virtual reality of exploitation, nastiness, narcissism, and selling junk food and junk drink and bad medicines and cosmetics to girls at age 6 and weapons to boys at age 6. It's just something that the society should come together on and protect our children.
I have a last question for you. That longevity is a huge topic of conversation today in our modern world. Everybody wants to live forever, and our listeners can judge for themselves the functioning of your wonderful mind. So what is the secret?
Well, I think the old saying, the only true aging is the erosion of one's ideals. If you develop your ideals, stick to your principles, have refined senses of justice and injustice, and always leave options open for revision, to use a phrase from Alfred North Whitehead, you're going to tend to take care of yourself. You're not going to be addicted to alcohol or drugs or tobacco. You're going to eat good food. You're going to exercise a bit. You're going to have a more stable, balanced life. And you're going to be rewarded with the great interest of human beings on earth, which is the pursuit of justice, as Senator Daniel Webster said over 150 years ago.
So, Ralph, you should run for president. I think that you're clearly more fit than the two current candidates.
Luigi, it's easier to do that in Italy. You know that.
Of course. That's for sure. At age 90, you can easily be elected president in Italy.
Well, onward and upward.
Thank you so much. Same
to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Big Brains. Big Brains brings you the stories behind the pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. Change how you see the world and keep up with the latest academic thinking with Big Brains, part of the University of Chicago podcast network.
With the rapid growth of AI, how can we regulate digital markets to encourage fair competition and drive innovation? How do we measure the impact of antitrust enforcement on innovation and productivity? Join Chicago Booth Stigler Center virtually for a conference on these questions. It's April 18th and 19th. Register to watch the live stream at chicagobooth.edu/StiglerAntitrust24. That's StiglerAntitrust24.
I have to say, in preparation for this interview, I read and listened to more than my fair share of episodes and talks, etc. And the guy is really, really compelling. And it says, first of all, in one of the things I listened to, they were saying, if there was a name for all his achievement, we will have a name of everything, from the seatbelt to the airbags. The fact that when we got bumped in an airline, we get actually some tickets and not stranded at the airport. The reduction in pollution, the way he changed this country for the better, never having a public office, is actually quite impressive.
It almost seems it would have been a shame had he been elected to public office, because it seems like he's done more being an outsider than he might have done had he become an insider, which is actually something that we should have asked him. And I could have kept talking. I could have continued talking to him forever. But that would have been a really interesting question: is if he feels there's something he could have accomplished as president that he didn't get to accomplish without holding the office. I wonder.
That's a very good question. I think he's too honest to be president. Even in the answer to my question, he was very, very honest. He said, yeah, we screwed up in that particular decision on the Virginia Pharmacy Board. So I think that level of honesty is unheard of in a politician, and I don't think it would have gone very far. I think that we didn't want to detract our conversation and enter into politics and enter into his run as a third-party candidate. But from what I read and what I saw, this is really a way to try to break a duopoly. So thinking in economic terms, there is a duopoly that doesn't really represent the American people because in some dimension, there is no alternative. And what he was trying to do is trying to give representation and voice to the people who don't have it. Both parties are very corporatist. And so you need some product differentiation. So we need to kill each other on abortion and right to teach some stuff to children, because when it comes to approve the corporate subsidies, we're all in favor. And we don't want anybody who is not in favor to even have the right to speak. That's a suppression of third-party run, because a third-party run can break this duopoly in which we play this game in which we are separate, but in fact, we are all on the same team when it comes to supporting large corporations.
I hate that I agree with that answer because it is so profoundly cynical and dispiriting, but I think I probably do. Although that said, it will be interesting to see what happens with some of these proposals about banning social media use for children, because that is anti-corporatist. That is taking on the social media companies, because that's precisely where the growth is, where the money is, how they groom kids in order to become prolific users of social media as they age. If you lose kids, that's a big blow. I could be wrong. I'd be open to an argument about this, but I don't think that banning social media for kids is just a distraction to the corporatist mantra that guides both parties. I think it actually is a serious undermining blow.
I completely agree, but let's see whether they are serious about it, because it's easier to say we ban TikTok because there is the anti-Chinese sort of agenda. But I'm not so sure that from that point of view, an American TikTok will be better than a Chinese TikTok. And so I think that the real question is whether a conservative government will be willing and able to actually have a real impact on the business model of social media. And I doubt that to be the case, but I am open to be wrong.
And it does go back to a question I asked him, which he didn't really answer, which is how he maintains his optimism in the face of what's happened over the decades since he's been active. And I guess I could have asked that question a different way, which is how, despite his activism, have things gotten worse, not better? Corporatism has only strengthened, and as he says, commercial interests are dominate every area of American life now. And I guess you could say that if it weren't for Ralph Nader, it would be worse. But it's hard to argue that he took a trend and bent the line in any meaningful way.
Actually, I would go even farther. I would say that Nader provoked the awakening of corporate power. And it's not that corporate power did not exist before, but what he proved that it was possible that by using the instrument of democracy and engagement, even somebody without a secretary, and there was an exchange in which somebody asked him, but it's true that you forged GM without a secretary. Even somebody without a secretary could basically make the largest corporation in America at the time accountable. And I think that the Powell Memorandum, which explicitly refers to him, is the fear of large corporations say, gee, If everybody understands the power of Ralph Nader, we are toast. So we need to change the rules before we have many Ralph Naders. And that's what happened from the 70s to today.
Oh, that's interesting. So for our listeners, explain the Powell Memorandum again. And I actually didn't know that it mentioned Ralph Nader. So tell me the context in which it mentions Ralph Nader.
So let me give you a little bit of context. And you cut me off when I go too long, because my kids, whenever they ask me some history story, they say I go too long. So feel free to cut me off. So Lewis Powell was a very powerful corporate attorney. He was hired by the American Chamber of Commerce to design a strategy to basically fight back. The late 60s are not a great period for corporate power. And not only there is the Nader, but the Nader fighting on GM, etc., but there is the Vietnam War. There is a lot of anti-business protest. Lewis Powell, that later would become Justice Powell, write this memo saying the American enterprise system is under attack by people like Ralph Nader. We need to fight back. How do we fight back? First of all, 1 year after Milton Friedman said that the only social responsibility of business is to make profits, he said, no. The social responsibility of business is not just to make profits, it's also to give money to fight basically these people. So the business should give a lot of money to lobby, to give campaign donation, to change the current climate. Second, we need to actually conquer the university, starting with the graduate school of business, who are particularly aligned with our view of the world. And we need to have a set of people who write constantly in newspapers pushing our ideas. Fourth, the untouched and unexploited area where we can make a difference is with the court. We need to change the court, starting with the Supreme Court, to be more pro-business. And the year after he wrote this memo, he was appointed to the Supreme Court, and actually he wrote the famous Bellotti decision in 1978, which is the foundation of Citizens United. The reason why we have Citizens United is because in 1978, Justice Powell wrote the Bellotti decision. So it was really a concerted plan that the American Chamber of Commerce put through, so much so that in 1997, when the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce retired, they actually toast to him for having implemented the Powell Memorandum.
But maybe there still is a way in which, even if he did help catalyze this mammoth corporate response, maybe there's a way in which his legacy will catalyze a backlash to it. Am I being too hopelessly Pollyanna-ish by saying that?
No, I think that in recent years we have seen a beginning of a comeback. Even Nader recognized that the antitrust is more effective and more concerned also with the issue of power. And there, again, to his honesty, he recognized basically that pushing only on the consumeristic side miss a very important element of the original antitrust. And he recognized that Lina Khan and Jonathan Kanter are bringing this aspect back. Now, it's not guaranteed they will continue because it's not obvious that it will be in office next year. But I think that is a positive sign that things are changing.
Capitalism is a podcast from the University of Chicago Podcast Network and the Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. The show is produced by me, Matt Hodap, and Lita Cesarine, with production assistance from Utsav Gandhi, Sebastian Burka, and Brooke Fox. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.